Well, it's been a big week on the macroeconomics front this week, with quarterly construction and business investment data released.
But we've got an even bigger week coming up next week with the RBA's September meeting and a likely woeful update to GDP.
Well, for his take, I spoke with Westpac senior economist Matt Hassan, and I started first by asking what he made of the fall in construction work done over the year.
In this day and age, a decline of 0.7% is pretty mild, when we're getting double-digit swings in most indicators. The surprise component within that really was private infrastructure, where we saw quite a strong gain, so that's dominated by mining activity. But even outside of that, some of the weakness that we expected to show through around residential and non-residential building wasn't quite there. So certainly for the second quarter, not as weak. I guess a thing to remember here is that through the April-May lockdown, construction was designated an essential service. So many projects continued, and so perhaps the disruptions weren't quite as pronounced. We also saw a little bit better numbers than expected for CapEx spending just out today.
Was it the mining sector again that was basically propping up those figures?
It was predominantly the mining sector. It was still a decline. This time it was more meaningful, so down nearly 6% overall. The surprise there was more around equipment spending. So equipment's the one thing that really gets pulled, gets yanked whenever there's uncertainty and there's a big shock happening. And we'd been expecting a record decline around that. It did fall just over 7.5%, but we were looking for something more meaningful than that. I guess, bear in mind here, some of these components, they can be very slow moving. There's planning and budgeting lags involved. But it is what it is. A slightly better than expected result.
So much of a sign that the government's various stimulus programs have been helping the construction sector yet? I mean, of course, home build is well known, but I understand residential construction, though, is still very weak within those figures. Yeah,
residential was down over 5% in the quarter. And the home builder program only really rolled out in July.
That's true.
It does look to have gained some traction. In particular, some states, Western Australia and I think Tasmania, the state governments have doubled up on that home builder support. Essentially, there's very generous support, especially if you're a first home buyer. And new home sales in Western Australia, for example, have trebled since the introduction of that policy. Again, it's going to take some time for that to flow through to activity and the forward plans. But it will be providing some support for the wider construction sector.
Well, just looking forward to next week, of course, we have the Reserve Bank meeting on Tuesday. Do you expect much of a change there? They haven't really changed policy now since March, I think.
No, I wouldn't expect any change, meaningful change from the RBA, particularly a day prior to the GDP release, the full national accounts, which that is going to be quite a momentous release on Wednesday. That's going to confirm what we all know, that the economy has moved into recession for the first time in nearly 30 years. And it also provides a lot of the detail that is very hard to piece together. As we've seen, construction and equipment spending hasn't been quite as weak as expected, but we know from hours worked that the quarter was terrible. And we know from some of the consumer piece and the net export piece that there's going to be a lot of things moving around. It's going to fill in.
So what is the figure, though, that you're expecting for that second quarter? What is the downturn?
Yeah, look, we expect it to show a 7% contraction.
7% contraction. Of course, that follows 0.3% in March, so it really is falling off a cliff.
That's right. So we meet the technical definition of back-to-back quarters, but it's a very large contraction. I think that's beyond anything. The previous largest contraction we would have seen would be about in the 2 to 2.5% range for a quarter, and that was way back in the mid-70s. It was a completely different world. This is unlike anything we've seen.
Well, we are, of course, halfway through the third quarter now. Is there any chance that the third quarter could actually be negative contraction as well because of the lockdown in Victoria?
Very much so. Unfortunately, that return to lockdown, I think to remember there, it's only Victoria, so only, but yes. It's a quarter of the economy. The rest, as I've said, seems to be reopening pretty well. The lockdown's heavier than in April, May, though. So sectors like construction this time around are affected. And the restrictions are tighter, including on domestic travel. So we think that the level of activity in Victoria is going to fall to below that April benchmark, possibly 15 to 20% below pre-COVID levels. And our assessment is that that's basically going to negate the reopening rebound that's showing through in the other states. So we land on a bit of line ball, basically flat for the quarter, but that could easily be another negative. I think the main takeout out from this is that the recovery or the rebound is going to be a staggered rebound by state, and it's going to be very messy. We'll have some states, getting back near business as usual by the end of the year, the likes of Western Australia. Victoria is going to be a much slower road to back to health.
All right, well, fingers crossed. Thank you for joining us, Matthew Hassan.
You're welcome.